And I'll make just a couple comments just as people are rolling in. Thanks again for joining us this evening. And again, I'm very excited about this study and appreciate the time and the perspectives that you share in these sessions. Again, we are also having this same discussion on Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. So if you don't have an opportunity to join during the week, you definitely have an opportunity to join us again on Sunday. We've had good participation at both sessions so far. So uh, encourage you to, as we kind of get through into this, just feel free to chime in with anything that you're thinking about. I enjoy conversation, although I do have a lot of material prepared just in case. But we are talking about the character of God, and specifically talking about Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7. And the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loyal love and faithfulness, keeping loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But he by no means leaves the guilty unpunished, responding to the transgression of fathers by dealing with children and children's children to the third and fourth generation. So very, very good couple of verses here to accurately describe God's character. And we talked about last week how it seems like there's a dichotomy between these two verses. They're very different. On one hand, we've got a gracious God, and then on the other hand, we have a God who does not leave the guilty unpunished, who visits transgressions of fathers by dealing with children and children's children. We talked about the tension between those two and how of course, there is a tension whenever you have a God who's willing to be gracious, but you have a people who is consistently rebellious. So that's what we see in the Old Testament, and it creates a very good background for us to just think about the Israelites coming out of Egypt and going to Mount Sinai and having the Ten Commandments almost given to them. But before that got a chance to happen, they built up a golden calf idol for themselves, and God got angry. And Moses came on the scene as intercessor, as we talked about, introduced that role into Israelite society, and that has become very important. So that will continue to come up as we go through this series. But from this point forward, we'll be focusing mostly on these characteristics of God, about how he's compassionate and gracious. Next week, we'll talk about his slowness to anger, and then we will wrap up with the final study on God's loyal love and faithfulness. So I have chosen to combine two topics that could very easily be topics in and of themselves. They could very easily be their own classes. So tonight we'll be focusing mostly on compassion. I am going to try to get to some comments about grace and graciousness, but again, it's just huge, and we've got 4 weeks here, and we're on week number 2, so we're almost halfway through. Definitely want to try to pack in as much material as we can. So knowing that, we'll be talking about compassion and how compassion makes its appearance in the Bible, especially within the context of these two verses and the Israelites' relationship with God. But we'll also be talking about compassion's relationship with grace. Something interesting to think about there. We know that as Christians, we're wholly dependent on God's grace. But grace, as it appears here in these two verses, at least the way that I interpret it seems like grace is very tied to and dependent on everything else that we see here. We can often study grace as its own quality, and it certainly can be its own quality. But I've personally come to believe that because God is compassionate, because God is slow to anger, and because he has loyal love, he can be and must be gracious. So if we depend on God's grace as Christians, if we as sinful people realize that we depend on God's grace, We know that we're also dependent on these other qualities just as much. And that thought even includes verse 7. God can only be gracious to save us of the consequences of sin if there are indeed consequences of sin. Okay, so it talks about that in verse 7 about how, if we are guilty, God will not leave us unpunished. But that creates the tension that we've talked about last week. How can we credit God for saving us if it is from God that we must be saved in the first place? And that's a very common misunderstanding that people generally have with this line of thinking. But we know that sin is much more than just thoughts or actions that God dislikes. We know that sin instead is the very things that oppose God's nature. And if we are involved in opposition with God, he will be in opposition with us. Just a couple of examples. We know that lying is wrong, but it's not just because God chose to dislike lying. It's because God is truth, and lies oppose his nature. We know that murder is wrong, but it's not due to any arbitrary rule that God made. It's because God is life, and murder opposes his eternal character. So it's these kinds of things that, as we think about God's grace and his compassion, and our position either for God or against God, it becomes a little bit more clear that we're talking about the things that God must save us from are not his destruction that he would willingly give, but his destruction that he would unwillingly give because he finds us in these very poor situations of sin. So as sinners before a holy God, we face judgment, eternal death because of sin. The wages of sin are death. But God, because he's compassionate, because he's gracious, because he's slow to anger, will lay aside that wrath whenever we turn back to him. So important guiding thoughts as we get into the session tonight. We know that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should have eternal life, but we'll get into that just a little bit later. So opening discussion for us tonight, just some questions to think about. Want to hear from you guys. How is it that you define compassion? What do you think?
Hey, Matt, this is Josh. How are you tonight?
Good.
I was thinking compassion, it's that grace, but it has a flavor of being nice and forgiving when maybe it wasn't necessarily called for, if that makes sense.
I think sometimes I would associate it almost like feeling sorry for something or somebody, but not like, but not really that either. It's the sentiment is, the feelings are kind of similar.
So not exactly pity, but something close to it.
Right there. That's a great way to say it.
Yeah, so similar to last week, I've got just a couple quotes to think about. Might have seen something similar to this before, but be kind. Everyone you meet is fighting a harder battle. It's kind of what I think about when I think about compassion. Trying to put myself in somebody else's shoes, just to understand what they're feeling. So why should we be compassionate?
Well, to me, one of the most compelling reasons is compassion was a trait that Jesus had. And if we're going to be his followers, then we're going to need to model that same trait of looking at people and having a sense of compassion for them. That is, feeling sorry, feeling pity, feeling love and concern, and wanting the best for them.
Good. I have a slide dedicated to that topic.
We can't possibly feel compassion for other people without wanting it ourselves. And we can't want it without trying to give it to others.
Yeah, this is one of those things. It's nice to get what's, if what goes around comes around, certainly hope we get more compassion coming our way. So I have no idea who this person is, but he says, too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, or the smallest act of caring, all of which have the potential to turn a life around. And isn't that what we believe as Christians, that if we go out and be the hands and feet of Jesus, who was the most compassionate, that we can certainly turn some lives around. So who in your own life has shown you compassion?
If compassion is pity, then I would say my wife has. She certainly felt sorry for me and allowed me to come into her life. So that's a little bit of a joke, but not entirely.
I like that. I like that. Yeah, I think about just people who have taught me things when I was in ignorance, or people who were kind to me. You know, it kind of goes back up to this other quote too. Anybody who has done all of the above has definitely showed me compassion. Let's see.
Matt, I got a comment. You know, we really understand what compassion means when we're at our lowest. You know, that's when we need it the most. And, you know, when we're down and someone would take us out, you know, that's when we really need compassion the most. And, you know, and there's many examples of that, because we all have been at low points.
Yeah.
Hey, Matt.
Hey,
It's Caitlin.
I see these dots you put up on the screen.
Josh.
I didn't know that would show up for everybody. I'm sorry, Matt.
Sorry.
Just don't
So,
do it. Go do
I
it.
want to make a point. That's so funny. So I would like to change my definition of compassion.
Okay.
I was talking to Josh. I feel like the sentiment is more like loving someone through their circumstances, maybe like in spite of what's going on or in spite of decisions that they've made, kind of loving someone through that. And, you know, I think as children and parents, you know, I think that's something that you do. You have compassion on your children, and my parents, I know, did on me. As you make mistakes, you love them through that, and you coach them through that, and you work through it. It feels kind of active and intentional, and maybe even contrary to what you might feel compelled to do if you weren't trying to be intentional. Like maybe your reaction might be to judge, you know, instead of showing kindness and love through a certain situation. So sorry for the giggles at the beginning.
You're good. It's funny. No, yeah, I agree with you. Compassion tends to come up, or is especially needed in situations where we want to go the opposite direction. So I appreciate that answer. So these other two questions are more just to think about, but where do you wish you could find more compassion? There's certainly different places in our society where we think could be lacking compassion. Those are places where we might be called to go to and provide that compassion. Or even that question of who do you wish? I can think of a few individuals in my life, but also just in their lives affect everybody's lives. They're in the public eye or something like that, where I wish we could find some more compassion. Or can we even get enough of it? Is this one of those things, just like grace, that we need as much as we can get? So we're going to watch the video and it is about 4 to 5 minutes long, and then we'll kind of discuss some of the main themes of it. But it really talks about just the word compassion as it appears in Hebrew. So I don't want anybody to get distracted by that too much. We'll talk through it a little bit. Sorry about that. I don't want anybody to get distracted by the Hebrew of it, but we'll just watch this video and see what we think.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it
Everyone hear the audio okay?
Yes.
Good deal.
could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently described God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. The very first word used in this description of God is compassionate, or in Hebrew, rachum. This word also appears as a noun, rachamim, or compassion. And what's fascinating is that both of these words are related to the Hebrew word for womb, rechem. So compassion in the Hebrew Bible is centered on a person's core, and the word invites us to imagine a mother's tender feelings for her vulnerable infant. So rahum is a word that conveys intense emotion. Sometimes it's even translated as deeply moved, like in the story of King Solomon, who meets two women who've just given birth. One of their babies sadly dies, but then both women claim that the baby still living is theirs. As a test, Solomon says to cut the baby in two and give each mother a half. And the baby's real mother is deeply moved. She would rather the other woman take her baby than see her child die. And it's her compassion that reveals that she's the true mother. But rahum isn't just an emotional word. It also involves action. And surprisingly, the word is used most often to describe God's actions, motivated by his emotions. Like when the Israelites are suffering and oppressed in Egypt, God hears their cries and is compelled by his compassion, his rachamim, to rescue them. Then, as the Israelites travel through the dangerous wilderness, they're hungry and thirsty, and God is Rachum, caring for them as his own child. He provides everything they need: food, water, and clothing, as he personally guides them. So it's no surprise that when Yahweh reveals his character to the Israelites in the wilderness, he begins by saying he's compassionate. But despite Yahweh's continual rachamim, the Israelites turn away from him time and again. They reject Yahweh's compassion and instead give their allegiance to other gods. And rather than showing compassion to each other, they do violence. And their rebellion results in exile, and they're scattered among the nations. And it's in this dark moment in Israel's story that we come to the book of Isaiah, where Yahweh compares himself to a mother full of rachamim toward her baby. He says, can a mother forget her nursing child, or have no compassion or rachamim on the child of her womb? Even if she forgets, I will not forget you. God is full of motherly compassion, and he will rescue his people. And as you read further in Isaiah, you realize that God is going to do this by entering into the suffering of humanity. And this points forward to a time when Jesus comes on the scene. He is Yahweh's deep compassion become human. In Greek, the word compassion is oiktirmos. And as Jesus embraces the sick and cares for the outcast, he is deeply moved by human suffering. Jesus compares himself to a mother hen using her wings to shield her chicks from danger as he gathers people into his embrace. And in the ultimate expression of oiktirmos, Jesus is moved by compassion to enter into humanity's suffering, into death itself, to rescue and bring us near to God. And it's this same life of compassion that Jesus calls his followers to imitate, allowing ourselves to be moved by the pain of others, to embrace the hurting, and to participate in relieving suffering in the world. In this way, we too can embody the compassion of Yahweh, or in Jesus' words, be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Now you can see how fitting it is that compassionate is the first word God uses to describe himself. So when we're in pain or see others suffering, we can be certain that God is deeply moved to respond and that he's there to meet us with his deep compassion. If you tried to describe what
All right. So great video. Again, always putting out really good stuff from the Bible Project. But basically what they're focusing on is God's compassion as it's described in the Bible. And it comes basically from this Hebrew, okay? The whole idea of compassion as it appears in the Hebrew is this idea of a womb or motherly love or deep feeling and emotion. So Hebrew, not going to get too much into it tonight, but just some general details of how and when this comes up and in the Bible. I typically, when thinking about translation, I don't think there's anything magic or mysterious about knowing the original, because it was spoken and written before English was even a thing. So we're really trying to get as close as we can, and compassion is the word that fits here. But if we look at the context of how and when it's used, we see some of these other ideas that come up. So it's used as an adjective, something to describe things, used as a noun, used as a verb, 99 different times in the Bible. But all of these words are closely related to a different word that uses the same three letters, okay? So it's kind of the same way as we say righteous for meaning somebody who follows God's law. But if you look at the root of that, it's the word right, which means the direction right. It means you're going the right way. It's same kind of concept that we're talking about here. So when we see these three letters used in Hebrew, we can generally think about the same type of thing. So whenever it's used just kind of on its own as rechem, it means womb. But if we turn it into an adjective, or we turn it into a noun, turn it into a verb, it starts to mean take on different connotations. So I don't want to confuse anybody too much with that, because just the general bottom line idea is when you see this word, it means compassion. And it evokes this image of tender care, much like what you would see an infant would receive from his or her mother. Okay. And then it comes up in some other different contexts. Deeply stirred is another way that it's translated sometimes. Somebody who had deeply stirred feelings, as we see in Genesis 43 here, as Joseph escapes the chamber weeping because his brothers have returned. Just a very emotional moment. Or just like what the video indicated, when Solomon had to help those two women decide who get to keep the baby, the woman who was actually the child's mother is the one who was deeply stirred over this. Okay, so really emotionally charged word that we see here. All right. As far as who it is used for, 80% of the time it's used for God, 20% of the time it's used for humans. Pretty interesting separation there. Of course, whenever you read the word compassion in the Bible, probably 80% of the time they're talking about just God's compassion in general. So it's like 80% of the content of the Bible is probably more related to God than it is to humans. But at the same time, it's pretty interesting to see that same separation here. Similarly, stirrings of the heart is another way that it can be used. Isaiah talking about God's stirring of his hearts and his compassion. And also kind of like what we talked about just a few minutes ago, to have pity. God here in Jeremiah talking about the opposite of compassion by saying he will not show pity. He will not be sorry. He will not have compassion for those who are rebellious against him. So lots of different ways it can be used. Oftentimes words are used to describe God's response when he hears his people crying out. That's a very large portion of the Bible where we see David crying out. We see the prophets crying out on behalf of the people. We hear the people themselves crying out for God's help and begging God to have compassion on them. And so that is God's natural emotional response to suffering. Kind of see that in the books of Nehemiah when they come back in from exile, and they're talking about God's great compassion and how they cried out to God, God heard them, and now they find themselves rebuilding the holy places. All right, so compassion is also used in contrast to anger, kind of like what we talked about a few minutes ago. In moments where God has every right to be angry, God should be praised for the moments where he is compassionate instead. All right, so several different instances in scripture there. And how about the New Testament? We've got two different words that compassion shows up in. And again, don't want to confuse anybody, but very similar uses. Oiktimos, pity, compassion, to have compassion or show mercy. And my favorite Greek word is splachnon. It means to be deeply moved, inner parts, full of compassion. But the way that my Greek teacher taught it to me, it's like your guts. It's like it's like the sound somebody would make if they plop down some guts on the table. So I think that's funny. It's fun to say, but kind of the general feel of the word is it's coming up from deep, deep within you. And that's how powerful it is. We can see this idea in the way that Jesus cares for people. He uses both, whenever it's talking about Jesus' compassion, it uses that first word. Whenever the apostles are later writing about Jesus's compassion and God's compassion, they tend to use the second word. So it's almost like his compassion grew as the story went on, which is really cool to see. But we know that Jesus goes throughout the first century area, through all of the cities and villages, teaching and having kindness, but he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. And that's certainly something that we can relate to. He gives healings based off of his compassion. He has compassion on the sick, the leprous, the blind, those who are grieving, those who are dead. And each one of those moments that he reaches out and heals, it comes from a place of deep love and deep compassion. And also, again, the imagery of a mother with their child. Jesus talks about being a mother hen and how he is going to collect his children together. Just as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. And that's a very powerful analogy that he uses just to express his care and his love and his devotion towards the people that he has come to save. So just to expound on that just a little bit more, so we can see just all throughout the Old Testament of God continually being compassionate to the Israelites, giving them manna in the desert, personally leading them with a cloud or with a pillar of fire, sending the plagues to personally intervene with their slavery, or giving words of warning to them, or taking care of them through the judges. Just all throughout the Old Testament, God is continually being this compassionate parent who is nurturing his child nation. And there's so many different examples of this, but it's just really great to see how God's love moves and how his heart is moved by his people. Whenever they are in need, he goes to rescue them, he cares for them. And he's depicted a lot of times just how a parent would view a child, is the way that he feels toward Israel and how God feels toward his people. Even when they're rebellious, he's trying to bring them back and help them grow and keep them planted with with him and in his law, and trying to squish that spirit of rebellion within them, just so he can further his purposes with them. He wants to see the best for them, just the same way that a parent would. All right, so you see that same word of compassion in these moments where there's a specific moment of a parent and a child being in context. Couple of different examples here. Really love the way that compassion is used in that story with Solomon and the two women fighting over the child too. That example kind of coming as the opposite effect of talking about how some of the other people surrounding Jerusalem were not the kind of people that they needed to be associated with. So sometimes he's described with imagery of a nursing mother who's constantly attentive to and thoughtful of her infant. Here in Isaiah, can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even though she may forget, I will not forget you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. So it's a mother's natural tendency just to have deeply stirring emotions for her child. And that just becomes consistently useful for describing the base condition of compassion. A helpless child and a loving mother just perfectly depict our own need and our own dependence on the one who's greater than us, the one who can show us the way and who loves us just as he would his own child and protects us and nurtures us and wants us to grow. There's another example, but from the father perspective, the father has compassion on his children. So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. Here he's talking about, is Ephraim not my dear son, the child in whom I delight? Indeed, as often as I have spoken against him, certainly I will remember him. Therefore my heart yearns, or my heart stirs for him. And surely he will have compassion on him. All right, so compassion is emotional. It's emotionally charged, but it's also full of action, just kind of as we have seen through here. Whenever we have compassion, it should motivate action. But we see that particularly with our need for forgiveness and the way that God provides forgiveness and deliverance. So I'm just going to quickly go through these. There's a lot of examples here. I kind of put too much in here, but it's just a great idea. As you go through these verses, you have several different statements that God makes, that he says, or a prophet says of God, that he will have compassion on us. And then there's an action statement right next to it. Okay, so Micah 7:19, he will have compassion on us and he will tread our iniquities underfoot. Or David, according to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Or God, being compassionate, forgave their iniquity. Okay, so God is not just feeling, he's also acting with great power and very prescriptive as well, because the people who need compassion the most are the ones who are transgressors. Another pretty interesting thing to think about in the light of verse 7. Those who are transgressors, we talked about last week, are the ones who should be worried the most. But those who turn away from their transgressions and instead pursue God tend to find the forgiveness and compassion that we talk about in verse 6. A few other examples. Again, there's way too much material here, so forgive me for going through this quickly. But this talks about deliverance and rescue, very similar to the way that we talked about forgiveness. We talked about how all throughout Israel's history, they're in bondage, they're in slavery, they're rebellious of God, but God continually promises that he will restore them. He will rescue them from captivity. He will deliver them from their enemies. But it's all contingent on them forsaking their own rebellion. I'm going to pause for a breath just so we can discuss any thoughts that have come up so far.
Hey, Matt, this is Josh. Caitlin and I were discussing a couple slides ago how the dual nature of the compassion. So the verse about showing compassion like a mother to the infant, and the kind of tender imagery of that. And that's how Caitlin is with our children, and I'd assume most mothers are. And then he shows it from the father's perspective, and he gets back, he says, those who fear, and I know that word is intermingled with respect often. So it's really neat to see Jesus, or the description of God encompassing both parents' perspective of the children's view of them. I had not seen it interlinked like that before. That was very interesting.
That's a great thing to point out. Again, compassion is an action word as much as it is emotional. For every feeling of compassion, there should be an equal action that shows it.
Yeah, maybe this is simplistic, but one way I've heard it explained is compassion without action is just passion.
Oh, that's good.
And the feeling maybe affects us, but it doesn't necessarily affect others in terms of improving them or blessing them or helping them in any way. Whereas a feeling that's put into action has the potential, at least, to benefit other people.
Good. So in the interest of time, and I really want to get to our discussion on grace, just to tie in the two ideas, I'm going to skip over a couple of slides. But just to kind of talk about that idea of action a little bit more, just how important it is for Jesus in our faith. We have evolved with the benefit of having Jesus and being Christians and having the writings of the apostles. We can have a very holistic understanding of both how God acted in the Old Testament, but also how God used Jesus to create the church as an instrument of his compassion. So as followers of Jesus, we have received the compassion of God. We have, as it says in 1 John, we have confessed our sins and we've received forgiveness because God is just, and we depend on that. We've got several different instructions in the New Testament that are asking us to actively go out and be compassionate in that same way. And we're using both of these words, that the oiktirmos, which means compassionate, but then also using the other word, meaning that we have feelings coming up from deep within us, and it's an affection, it's a compassion, but it's something that's very deep and real and meaningful. It's not something that's passing. It's when we look at somebody who needs compassion, we feel in such a way that we cannot do anything but act. So I really like the way that you put it there, Steve. Compassion without action is just passion. Really great way to look at it. And I've seen this kind of floating around, but it's really made me think, because this is one of the greatest barriers, I think, that we have to actually showing compassion, is that we think that somebody in the situation that we see them in is pretty much the culmination of everything that they've experienced and should be worth. We really shouldn't consider anything else that they've been through. It's just what we see is what we get, but that's really not the case. If we're to truly show compassion to other people in the same way that God shows compassion to us, God sees the full picture and he still shows us compassion. So it's doubly challenging for us who, whenever we know just a very small portion of what somebody has been through, and make that and use that as our decision whether or not we should act for or against somebody else. But why you should be gentle with some people, well, you just don't know a whole lot about what somebody else has gone through.
Matt, also along with compassion, and you were talking about it's usually followed by an action. James tells us in 4:17, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin.
Great. That's a great application of that verse. Okay, so just general comments of how compassion and grace show up together in the Bible. So we see gracious and compassionate together lots of different times. So we've got this one version of the Hebrew word for compassion that is used 13 times, and 11 of those 13 times, it also comes with it the word for gracious. Okay, so the two ideas you could say that the two ideas are generally tied together. And a lot of different verses go on to prove that. But more often than not, when we see this, it is in the context of people who have failed, people who have come to transgress. But it's a really good reminder for us that God is compassionate. And because God is compassionate, that serves as a good, compelling thing to remember on our way back to God. So again, a lot of different examples here, but in the context of Exodus 34, the Israelite people had transgressed, they built up an idol, and God still was compassionate on them and finished making the covenant that he wanted to make with them. The Psalm, we know that David had his own issues, but he continually remembered that the Lord is gracious, the Lord is compassionate. Deuteronomy, showing fear at the beginning of Deuteronomy, but they're strengthened by the reminder that that God is compassionate. He will not fail you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers. Nehemiah, again, just a beautiful story of people coming home and being extremely thankful to a God who, although had allowed them to end up in bondage because of the consequences of their sin, at the same time they were thankful to God and acknowledged him, worshipped his graciousness and his compassion whenever they were able to return home. Okay. So time and time again, we see this this pattern of people who fall from grace, realize that they've fallen from grace, realize that they need grace, turn right back around to God to seek his compassion. So it's used in parallel construction for a reason, and it's for the reason that we see in 1 John. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us of our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. And that is such an important verse to read in conjunction with Exodus 34 verses 6-7. Because so many people do get hung up on that second verse and don't realize that, yes, there is forgiveness available. A just God must punish sin, but because we believe in Jesus's airtight case where he took that punishment and experienced it for us, it would be unjust for God to punish that sin twice. And so we are wholly dependent on God's grace. When we confess our sins, when we seek him, when we focus on him and live our lives for him, we get to look forward to having that forgiveness And if anybody does sin, the same section says that we have an advocate, and that's Jesus Christ, and he continually just refutes the case of condemnation against us and says, I have taken care of this, and that is the grace that continually cleanses us. So to finish off tonight, I wanted to show the video on grace just kind of as a cap off. So we'll watch, it's only 4 to 5 minutes, and then we'll call it. We can have a little bit more discussion if you'd like to stick around, but I would like to show the video just as kind of a final wrap up of tonight's thoughts.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at the second key word in this statement, gracious. The Hebrew word is chanun, which is related to the Hebrew noun chen. This word, chen, is often translated as grace or favor, and if you study how this word is used throughout the Bible, you find a fascinating story. One meaning of chen is delightful or favorable. In the Psalms, a skilled poet is said to have lips of chen. That is, he can craft beautiful words that bring delight. Or a dazzling piece of jewelry is an ornament of chen. It attracts attention and favor. This is why chen is often the word used to describe a gift given with delight or favor. In these cases, chen could be translated as grace. Like in the story of Esther, who approaches the king of Persia to ask that she and her people be spared from death. She calls this a request for chen. And because the king delights in Esther, he favors her and grants her wish. So, giving a gift of favor is chen because it's motivated by delight. And the most extreme kind of chen is showing favor to someone who should get what they deserve, not a generous gift. Like Jacob, who cheated his brother Esau, ran away, and then after 20 years wants to come back and make things right. So he comes to Esau asking, "May I find chen in your eyes?" Jacob isn't asking for what is fair, but for favor. And surprisingly, that's what Esau gives him. He chooses to delight in his brother Jacob and show him grace that he doesn't deserve. Now, chen requires a generous spirit, which people sometimes have. But in the Bible, the one who shows more chen than anyone else is God. Like when God rescued the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and they quickly betray him by giving their allegiance to a golden idol as their God. But then, Moses steps in and asks God to consider giving a gift that they don't deserve. And God says yes, by showing the ultimate act of chen, forgiveness and a promise to be with these people. This character trait of God is so reliable that over 40 times in the book of Psalms, people cry out for God's chen when they're sick or in danger, or when the Israelites are in exile. And the biblical prophets like Isaiah looked back to God's chen in the past and boldly declared that God will one day show chen to his people by delivering them and all creation from death and ruin. Now, when we turn to the authors of the New Testament, they describe God's chen with the Greek word charis, which means gracious gift. Like when we're introduced to Jesus in the Gospel of John, we're told that Jesus is God's glorious charis become human, sent into a world of people trapped in darkness and death. Because according to the Apostle Paul, we're like the living dead. God has handed humanity over to the destructive consequences of our selfish decisions. But, Paul says, God is rich in mercy, and by his charis, he's rescued us. He's talking about how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are offered to us as a generous gift of life that is more powerful than death. And as with any gift, all one has to do is receive it. So, now you can see why the biblical authors talk so much about this description of God's character throughout the Bible. When people are willing to own their failures and ask God for chen, he has a consistent and generous response. God gives the gift of himself, his life, and his love. And this is what it means that God is gracious. If you tried to
Compassion and grace, very closely related. Can't have one without the other, in my opinion. But ultimately, in either case, we're getting something that we do not deserve. And so that is a great character quality of God. That's something that he gives freely, openly. It's something that I think we can all be grateful for. Any concluding thoughts from anyone tonight?
I don't know, maybe the best takeaway for us is if God is compassionate and gracious, then maybe we ought to demonstrate those traits a little more frequently than we sometimes do.
I agree.
Thank
Well,
you
I think
again, Matt. My thoughts were just, I guess I never thought about compassion's an easy emotion, but compassion without action is maybe not compassion, you know. Or excuse me, compassion without action, you know, the follow up, like you said, you know, God has compassion and he acts. And anyways, I never put those two together, honestly.
The Samaritan showed great compassion. It was somebody didn't know, and it was somebody that was not an enemy, but they were two nations that disliked each other. But he still went more than the extra mile to help him.
Absolutely. Well, next week we will talk about one topic. I think you've all been compassionate and gracious to endure a very dense session tonight. A lot of good material from the Bible Project. I wanted to just highlight the best parts of it. Thank you so much for your attention and your participation. I hope you all have a great week. We'll see you next week, or we'll see you Sunday.
Thank you, Matt.
See you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
See ya.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.